The heavy iron gates of the Sterling estate groaned open, revealing a driveway that seemed to stretch on forever. It was lined with perfectly trimmed trees that stood like soldiers at attention, leading up to a mansion that looked less like a home and more like a museum. This was the world of Richard Sterling. He was a man who had built an empire out of nothing but grit and sheer will. To the outside world, he was a king. He owned skyscrapers in the city and shipping ports across the ocean. But inside these walls, the silence was loud. It was the kind of silence that comes when everyone is too afraid to speak. Richard sat in the back of his black town car, his eyes glued to a tablet, reviewing spreadsheets even though it was well past midnight. He didn't look at the trees or the stars. He only looked at numbers. He believed that if you controlled the numbers, you controlled your life. Emotions were messy variables that he didn't have time for. When the car pulled up to the grand entrance, a man in a crisp suit opened the door. This was Mr. Graves, the estate manager. Graves was a tall, thin man who ran the house with the same efficiency Richard ran his companies. He didn't smile, and he didn't small talk. "Good evening, sir," Graves said, his voice echoing slightly in the cool night air. Richard stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks. "Is the girl in her room?" he asked, not bothering with a greeting. "Yes, sir. She has been there since dinner. She did not eat much." Richard grunted. "She needs to eat. She has a big week ahead." He walked past Graves and into the massive foyer. The floor was marble, the ceiling was high enough to fit a giant chandelier, and the air smelled of lemon polish and expensive flowers deep inside the house. Away from the grand entrance lived the only person who made the house feel real. Her name was Marjorie. She was an older woman, with skin the color of deep coffee and hands that were worn from years of scrubbing, polishing, and lifting. She had worked for the Sterling family for 2 decades, long before the money really started rolling in. She had seen Richard when he was just starting out, and she had seen him become the hard man he was today. Marjorie was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters for the 3rd time that day. She moved with a slow, steady rhythm. She wasn't just cleaning. She was caring. This was her way of showing love. She heard the heavy footsteps in the hallway and knew immediately who it was. She didn't flinch. She just rinsed her cloth in the sink and squeezed out the water. "Marjorie," Richard's voice boomed as he entered the kitchen. It was a command, not a greeting. "Mr. Sterling," she replied softly, turning to face him. "Can I get you some tea? Or maybe a sandwich?" "No. I want to talk about the girl. About Ilara." Marjorie dried her hands on her apron. She had a soft spot for Ilara. The girl had been adopted when she was just a toddler, taken from a difficult situation and brought into this palace of cold stone. Ilara didn't have Richard's coldness. She had fire. She felt things deeply, which often clashed with Richard's need for control. "She seems restless lately," Marjorie said gently. "She's a young woman, sir. She needs to explore, to meet people her own age. She spends all day in this big house with just the staff and her books. She is preparing for her future," Richard snapped, walking over to the massive island in the center of the kitchen. "I didn't bring her here to make friends with the neighbors. I brought her here to give her opportunities I never had. She is going to university next year. She needs to focus." "She is lonely, Mr. Sterling," Marjorie said. It was a brave thing to say to a man like him, but she felt she had to speak up. She often acted as the bridge between the father and daughter. Loneliness can make a person do things they wouldn't normally do. Richard scoffed. "Lonely? She has a library, a theater room, a gym, and anything else she could possibly want. She isn't lonely. She is ungrateful." He turned to leave, then stopped. "There is a gala on Friday, the Business Leaders Summit. I expect her to be on my arm. She needs to learn how to network. Make sure her dress is ready." "She doesn't like those events, sir," Marjorie tried to explain. "She feels like a trophy there. People talk at her, not to her." "That is the price of the life I provide," Richard said coldly. "See that she is ready. And Marjorie, stop filling her head with these ideas. You are the maid. Do your job." With that, he turned on his heel and marched out of the kitchen, his shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. Marjorie watched him go. She didn't feel angry, just sad. She had seen this dynamic play out for years. Richard bought things to fix problems that money couldn't fix. He thought a gala was a substitute for a conversation. Later that night, Marjorie made her way up the back staircase, carrying a tray with a cup of hot cocoa and a few cookies. She reached the door of Alara's room. It was a large suite, bigger than most people's apartments, but it often felt like a cell to the girl living in it. She knocked softly. Alara. "It's me." "Come in," a muffled voice replied from inside. Alara was sitting on her window seat, looking out at the city lights in the distance. Her room was filled with expensive gadgets and designer clothes, but she looked small and fragile. She had been crying. Her eyes were red and puffy. Marjorie set the tray down on the nightstand. "I brought you a little something," she said with a warm smile. "I know you didn't eat your dinner." Alara looked at the older woman. "I'm not hungry, Margie. I can't breathe in here." Lara used the nickname she had given Marjorie when she was little. It was a word that meant safety. "It's just a big house, baby." "It's just walls," Marjorie said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "It's not the house," Alara said, her voice shaking. "It's him. He came in here earlier. He told me I have to go to that gala on Friday. He said I represent the family brand. He didn't ask me how I am. He didn't ask about school. He just talked about his image." Marjorie reached out and stroked Alara's hair. "He loves you in his own way, Alara. He just doesn't know how to show it." "He loves control," Alara corrected her. "He treats me like one of his statues. I'm not allowed to go out. I'm not allowed to have friends over because they aren't the right kind of people. I'm going crazy, Margie. I feel like if I don't get out of here soon, I'm going to disappear." Marjorie felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew that look in Alara's eyes. It was a look of desperation. She had seen it before in kids who had nothing left to lose. "You just have to hold on a little longer," Marjorie soothed. "You're almost 18. Soon you'll be off to college, and you can make your own life." "That's 2 years away," Alara said, wiping her eyes. "I can't do 2 years." They talked for a while longer. Marjorie told her stories about the old days trying to distract her. Alara laughed a little, which made Marjorie feel better. Eventually, Alara drank her cocoa and lay down. Marjorie tucked her in, just like she did when Alara was a little girl. "Get some sleep now," Marjorie whispered. "You'll be here in the morning?" Alara asked, sounding like a little child again. "Every morning," Marjorie promised. "Right here." Marjorie turned off the light and left the door slightly ajar, just the way Alara liked it. She walked back down the long hallway to her own small room in the basement. She was tired. Her back hurt and her feet were swollen, but her mind was racing. She worried about Alara. The girl was fragile, and Richard was too blind to see the cracks forming. Around 2 in the morning, the house was completely silent. Even the staff had gone to their quarters. In the darkness of her room, Alara lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The conversation with Marjorie had calmed her for a moment, but the heavy feeling in her chest had returned. The walls felt like they were closing in. She thought about the gala on Friday, standing next to her father in a stiff dress, smiling at people who didn't care about her, listening to speeches about money while she felt empty inside. She sat up. The moon was shining through the window, casting a silver light on the floor. She grabbed a backpack from her closet and threw in a few things: jeans, a hoodie, a notebook, and a photo of her real mother that she kept hidden. She didn't have a plan. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't be here. Alara opened her window. It was on the 2nd floor, but there was a trellis covered in thick ivy that ran down the side of the house. She had seen it 1,000 times. She threw her legs over the sill. The night air was cold, biting at her face. It felt sharp and real. She took a deep breath and climbed down, her hands trembling, her heart pounding against her ribs. When she hit the grass below, she froze. She looked back at the massive dark house. It looked like a sleeping monster. For a second, she thought about going back. But then she thought of Richard's voice, telling her who to be. She couldn't do it. She started walking toward the back gate. It was usually locked, coated with a security system. But as she got closer, she saw that the groundskeeper had left a small service gate propped open with a brick. likely to bring equipment through in the morning. It was a tiny accident, a mistake. For Alara, it was an exit. She slipped through the gate and out into the world. The streets were quiet. She walked 4 miles away from the manicured lawns and the security patrols, heading toward the heart of the city. The further she walked, the rougher the streets became. The sidewalks became uneven, and the streetlights became dimmer. Eventually, her legs grew tired. She didn't have money for a taxi or a bus. She hadn't thought that far ahead. She found herself in a part of the city she had only seen from the car window. It was gritty and loud, even at night. There were groups of people on corners and trash piled high on the curbs. Fear began to set in. The anger that had fueled her escape was fading, leaving only cold reality. She found a bus stop shelter. But it was already occupied by a few people who looked aggressive, so she kept walking, eventually exhausted and shivering in her thin pajama top and hoodie. She found a grate on the sidewalk that was letting out warm air from a subway tunnel below. Alara sat down on the hard concrete. She pulled her knees to her chest to keep warm. This was real. No marble floors, no soft pillows, no Marjorie bringing her cocoa. Just the hard, cold ground and the sound of distant sirens. Tears streamed down her face, drying on her cheeks. She put her head on her knees and closed her eyes, trying to pretend she was anywhere else. She fell asleep there, a tiny figure huddled against the wall of a building. While miles away, her adoptive father slept soundly, believing she was safe in her room, unaware that his world was about to come crashing down. Asterisk. The city lights of the downtown district usually meant business to Richard. They represented power, money, and the constant hum of the machine he had spent his life building. But tonight, stuck in the back seat of his town car, those lights were just a nuisance. It was nearly midnight, and the roadblocks set up for a downtown construction project had turned a 20-minute drive into an hour of crawling traffic. Richard tapped his finger impatiently on the leather armrest. The car inched forward, brakes squeaking as they stopped again at a red light. He glanced at his watch. He had a conference call with Tokyo in an hour, and he hated being late. He looked out the tinted window, expecting to see nothing but concrete and shadows. The neighborhood they were driving through wasn't the financial district. It was the edge of the industrial zone, a place where warehouses and old apartment buildings sat shoulder to shoulder. It was a world away from his gated estate. As the car idled, Richard's eyes scanned the sidewalk out of habit. He saw a few people huddled in doorways, a reality of city life that he usually chose to ignore. He was a man who believed in pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and seeing people sleeping on the street often just made him angry rather than sympathetic. He felt they were failures of the system, or failures of their own making. But then, the car passed under a flickering street lamp, and something caught his eye. "Stop," Richard said, his voice sharp. The driver, a young man named Thomas, flinched. "Sir, the light is green, and traffic is moving slowly, but I shouldn't stop here." "I said stop," Richard commanded, leaning forward. "Pull over to the curb. Now." Thomas steered the heavy car toward the side of the road, narrowly missing a pothole. Richard didn't wait for the car to come to a complete halt before he was pressing the button to lower the window. The cool night air rushed in, smelling of exhaust and damp pavement. He squinted, looking back at the spot they had just passed. There, lying on a sidewalk vent that was puffing out warm steam from the subway below, was a figure. It was a small person, curled up into a tight ball, trying to conserve heat. They were wearing a gray hoodie, looking dirty and discarded. Richard's heart hammered against his ribs, a sensation he hadn't felt in years, not since the early days when a bad deal could have bankrupted him. He grabbed the door handle and pushed it open. Thomas called out, reaching for the handle on his side. But Richard was already out on the street. The soles of Richard's expensive Italian shoes hit the grimy pavement. He ignored the strange looks from a group of men standing outside a bodega across the street. He walked quickly, his coat billowing behind him. As he got closer, the panic rose in his throat. The person on the ground wore a specific gray hoodie with a small embroidered logo on the chest, a crest of a shield. Richard knew that crest. It was from the private academy Alara attended. He reached the figure and knelt down. ignoring the dirt staining his trousers. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, terrified of what he might see, then reached out a hand and touched the person's shoulder. "Ilara," he whispered, his voice cracking. The figure stirred. The movement was sluggish and heavy. Slowly, the girl turned her head. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair was matted against her forehead, and her eyes were puffy and red. But there was no mistaking her. It was his daughter. She blinked up at him, confusion clouding her eyes. She looked like a frightened animal, unsure if she was dreaming or if the danger was real. "Dad?" she croaked. Her voice was raspy and weak. Richard felt a wave of nausea hit him. This wasn't possible. This wasn't his world. His daughter was supposed to be in her room, safe behind walls that cost millions of dollars to build. She was supposed to be angry at him, maybe ignoring him, but she was supposed to be safe. "What are you doing here?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. He reached out and touched her cheek. Her skin was ice cold. Ilara tried to sit up, wincing as her stiff muscles protested. She looked around, seemingly realizing for the first time where she was. The reality of the situation came crashing back down on her. She looked at her father, the powerful businessman who looked so out of place on this dirty street. And then she looked at his shoes. "I ran away," she whispered, tears starting to well up in her eyes again. "I couldn't stay in that house. I just couldn't." Richard didn't know what to do. He wanted to yell at her. He wanted to grab her and shake her and ask her if she knew how dangerous this was. He wanted to lecture her on the risks she had taken. But when he looked at her shivering in the thin hoodie, all the anger drained out of him, replaced by a terrifying fear. "You're freezing," he said. He quickly took off his heavy wool coat and draped it over her shoulders. It engulfed her, smelling of his cologne and dry cleaning. Ilara clutched the coat around herself, pulling it tight. It was the warmest thing she had felt in hours. "Can you walk?" Richard asked, helping her to her feet. She stumbled a bit, but Richard caught her. He was surprised by how light she was. He realized then that he hadn't really hugged her or held her in years. He didn't know she had become so fragile. "Yes," she whispered, leaning heavily against him. They walked back to the car. Thomas had gotten out and was holding the rear door open, his eyes wide with shock. He helped Richard guide Ilara into the back seat. She curled up immediately, wrapping Richard's coat tighter around her. Shrinking into the corner of the leather seat, Richard got in after her. He turned to the driver. "Take us home." "Thomas, drive fast." "Yes, sir," Thomas said, shutting the door firmly. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving the dark street behind. Inside the car, the silence was different than before. It wasn't a controlling silence. It was a heavy, suffocating tension. Richard watched Ilara. She was staring out the window, watching the unfamiliar neighborhoods pass by. Refusing to look at him, he felt a mix of emotions swirling in his chest: guilt, anger, relief, and a profound sense of failure. He had built an empire. He could move markets with a single phone call, but he couldn't keep his own daughter from running away to sleep on a sidewalk grate. "I looked for you," Ilara said suddenly, still not looking at him. Richard blinked. "What? In the house," she said softly. "I looked for someone to talk to, but it's so big and empty." "You have everything you need," Richard started, the automatic response kicking in. But he stopped himself when he heard how stupid it sounded. He looked at her dirty face and the tear tracks on her cheeks. Ilara turned to him then, eyes flashing with a sudden fierce anger. "I don't need things, Dad. I need you to actually see me. I'm not a project. I'm not an investment. I'm your daughter. But you don't even know me." Richard sat back, stunned by her words. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, to explain that he worked hard for her, that he did this for her future. But the image of her sleeping on that dirty vent blocked the words in his throat. He stayed silent for the rest of the ride. He watched the city lights blur past, thinking about the argument they had earlier. He thought about Marjorie, the housekeeper, who had been trying to tell him something similar for years. He realized he had been deaf to it all. As they approached the estate, the iron gates loomed ahead. They were supposed to represent safety. But as the car drove through them and pulled up to the front of the mansion, Richard realized they were just bars. They kept people in just as much as they kept people out. The massive front doors opened. Mr. Graves rushed out, looking flustered. He had clearly been alerted by the security gate. "Sir, is everything all right?" "We were not expecting you back," so Graves stopped speaking when he saw Alara step out of the car, wrapped in Richard's coat, looking disheveled and dirty. His eyes went wide. Richard helped Alara out. "Get the doctor," Richard barked at Graves, "and have the cook make hot soup." "Now." "Yes, sir, right away," Graves stammered, turning and running back into the house. Alara stood on the porch, looking at the big door. She hesitated. "I don't want to go in there," she whispered. "Need to get warm," Richard said gently. "Please." She let him guide her inside. The house was immaculate, quiet, and perfect. It felt like a shrine compared to the messy reality of the world outside. As they walked through the foyer, Richard felt a shift in the atmosphere. This wasn't the safe haven he thought it was. This was the place that had pushed her away. He took her to the living room and sat her down on the velvet sofa. He covered her with a blanket from the back. Marjorie appeared in the doorway, her face full of alarm. She saw Alara and gasped, rushing over. "Oh my goodness, baby. Are you hurt?" Marjorie cried, kneeling beside the girl. Alara leaned into Marjorie, finally allowing herself to cry. "I'm okay, Margie. I'm okay." Marjorie looked up at Richard, her eyes full of questions, but Richard didn't meet her gaze. He turned away, walking toward the window, looking out at the dark garden. He felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He had brought her back, but he knew the problem wasn't fixed. He looked at Marjorie, comforting his daughter, the ease between them, the love. Then he looked at his own reflection in the glass. A dark thought began to form in his mind, a terrible, twisting thought. He was angry. Angry at the world, angry at the situation, but mostly he was angry that his control had slipped. He needed someone to blame for this humiliation. He couldn't blame himself. He was the great Richard Sterling. It had to be someone else's fault. His eyes narrowed as he watched Marjorie smoothing Alara's hair. The seeds of a cruel decision were being planted in his mind, hidden behind the mask of a concerned father. The doctor came and went, giving Alara a clean bill of health apart from a bad cold and some bruising. He prescribed rest and fluids. Once the front door clicked shut, locking the outside world away again, the silence of the mansion returned. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against the walls of the pristine living room. Richard stood by the fireplace, watching the flames dance. He had a glass of scotch in his hand, even though it was nearly 3 a.m. His knuckles were white as he gripped the crystal glass. He felt like he was vibrating with a mixture of relief and a burning acidic rage in the center of the room. Marjorie was busy tucking a blanket around Alara, who had finally fallen asleep on the sofa. The older woman moved with a gentle efficiency, her hands brushing the hair away from the girl's forehead. She whispered soft words of comfort, her back turned to Richard. How could this happen? Richard's voice cut through the quiet like a whip crack. Marjorie didn't jump. She had worked for him long enough to know his moods. She slowly turned around, her face calm but tired. "She is a young woman, Mr. Sterling. She has a mind of her own." She was hurting. She was sleeping on a grate. Marjorie, Richard growled, turning to face her. "In the dirt. With the rats and the criminals. My daughter. Do you have any idea what that does to me? Do you have any idea how dangerous that was?" "I know," Marjorie said softly. "I tried to talk to her earlier. I told you she was lonely. I told you she was struggling. You are the one who is supposed to be watching her," Richard shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. Alara stirred in her sleep, murmuring something but didn't wake up. Richard lowered his voice to a harsh hiss, taking a step closer to the housekeeper. "I pay you to maintain this house. I pay you to ensure things run smoothly. Security is your domain when I am not here. The gates, the locks, the staff, that is your responsibility." Marjorie straightened her back. She was a small woman, but she had a dignity that made her seem tall. "I cook the meals, Mr. Sterling. I clean the floors. I love that girl like she is my own flesh and blood. But I am not her jailer. You cannot lock a heart behind iron gates." Don't you dare preach to me, Richard spat. He felt irrational, cornered by his own guilt, and he needed a target. He couldn't be angry at himself. He was the provider, the victim of circumstance in his own mind. He couldn't be angry at Alara. She was the child, and she was safe now. That left only one person. She got out, Richard said, his eyes narrowing. How did she get out? The alarms didn't go off. The gate codes are secure. She climbed the fence at the back, near the old garden, Marjorie said honestly. The ivy there is thick. And whose job is it to trim that ivy? Whose job is it to check the perimeter? Richard demanded. He was ignoring the fact that he hadn't authorized funds for garden maintenance in months, or that the security system in the garden wing was outdated. She was desperate. Mr. Sterling, she didn't leave because the ivy was too long. She left because the house was empty, Marjorie said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. Richard took a deep breath, his face turning red. He didn't want to hear the truth. He wanted obedience. He wanted control. In his mind, Marjorie had failed him. She had allowed the unthinkable to happen. She had let his precious asset, his daughter, wander into danger. I have had enough, Richard said coldly. He set his glass down on the mantel with a sharp clink. I came home to find my child on the street because the staff in this house is incompetent. Because you were too busy gossiping or cleaning to notice she was gone? Marjorie stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. Incompetent? I've raised her since she was in diapers. I was the one who bandaged her knees when she fell. I was the one who sat up with her when she had nightmares. You were never here. That is irrelevant. Richard roared. I am here now, and I am saying that you failed. He walked over to the desk, pulled out an envelope, and threw it at her. It bounced off her chest and landed on the floor. Your final check. Get your things and get out. Marjorie looked at the envelope on the floor, then up at the man she had worked for 20 years. She saw the fear in his eyes, masquerading as anger. She realized that arguing was useless. You cannot reason with a man who is busy blaming everyone else to avoid looking in the mirror. If I go, Marjorie said quietly, there will be no one here who actually loves her. I am her father. Richard yelled, That is enough. Marjorie looked down at the sleeping Alara one last time. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of him. She bent down slowly, her joints aching, and picked up the envelope. Fine, she whispered. I will go. Don't you dare come back, Richard said, turning his back to her to stare into the fire. I will have your name removed from the security list immediately. Marjorie didn't reply. She walked out of the living room, her footsteps slow and heavy on the marble floor. The silence of the house seemed to mock her as she made her way to the small room in the basement that had been her home for 2 decades. She packed her belongings into a single suitcase. It didn't take long. She didn't have many things. A few clothes, some books, cheap jewelry box with trinkets Alara had given her over the years. She took the framed photo of her own children from the nightstand and wrapped it in a towel. She paused at the door, looking around the tiny room. It was strange how a place could feel like home one minute and a prison the next. She thought about going back upstairs to wake Alara, to tell her she was leaving, to say goodbye. But she knew Richard would stop her. And she didn't want to cause a scene that would hurt the girl any more than she was already hurting. With a heavy heart, Marjorie walked up the basement stairs and out the service door. The night air was cold, just like it had been when Richard found Alara. She stood on the steps for a moment, looking at the mansion. It was a beautiful house, big and bright, but it looked like a skeleton to her now bare bones with no heart. She walked toward the street, carrying her suitcase, fading into the shadows. Upstairs. Richard stood by the window, watching her go until she disappeared from view. He felt a dark satisfaction, a feeling that he had cut out the rot. He thought that by firing the person who had let this happen, he was fixing the problem. He turned back to look at Alara, still asleep on the couch. He pulled the blanket up higher around her shoulders. I protected you, he whispered to the sleeping girl. I got rid of the problem. Now, you are safe. But as he looked at her peaceful face, the house felt larger and emptier than it ever had before. He had removed the one person who could actually reach her, all in the name of protecting his own pride. And in the silence, the seeds of his mistake had already begun to take root, waiting for the morning sun to reveal the damage he had done. The morning light filtered through the heavy velvet curtains, but it didn't bring the usual warmth to the Sterling estate. The sun was bright, yet the house felt as if a shadow had been painted over every room. Richard woke up with a heavy head, the remnants of the scotch still lingering in his system. For a moment, as he rubbed his eyes, he forgot the events of the night before. He went through his usual routine, checking his phone, looking at the stock market opening in Asabi, for the memory came crashing back. Ilara, the street, the shouting. He dressed quickly, his movements stiff and robotic. He needed to be in control. He needed to see that his daughter was safe, and that order had been restored when he walked into the dining room. The long mahogany table was set for one, but Ilara was sitting at the far end. She was picking at a piece of toast, her eyes puffy and red. She looked small in the vastness of the room. When she saw Richard, she didn't smile. She didn't look up. She just looked at her plate. "Did you sleep?" Richard asked, his voice gruff. He tried to sound like a caring father, but it came out like a boss asking a subordinate about a missed deadline. Ilara shrugged. "A little. Good. That is good. The doctor said you need rest." Richard poured himself a cup of coffee. He took a sip, grimacing at the bitterness. He stood there, watching her, waiting for her to say thank you. He expected gratitude that he had found her, that he had brought her back to this palace. But she said nothing. The silence between them was thick, filled with words that neither of them knew how to say. "Margie usually makes eggs," Ilara whispered suddenly, her voice barely audible. "These are cold." The mention of the housekeeper's name made Richard's chest tighten. He straightened his tie and cleared his throat. "Marjorie is gone, Ilara." Ilara's fork clattered onto her plate. She looked up, her eyes wide. "Gone? What do you mean gone? It's her day off?" "No," Richard said, walking toward the window to avoid her gaze. "I fired her." The silence that followed was absolute. It was so quiet that Richard could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He waited for her to understand. He waited for her to see that he had done it to protect her. "You fired her?" Ilara's voice rose, shaky and filled with disbelief. "Why, she didn't do anything." "She did plenty," Richard snapped, turning back to face her. "She was responsible for you. She'll let you wander out of that house. She'll let you put yourself in danger. She was negligent, Ilara. She failed to do her job." "That's not true." Ilara cried, pushing her chair back and standing up. "She tried to stop me. She talked to me for hours yesterday. She loved me." "If she loved you, she wouldn't have let you leave," Richard argued, his voice getting louder. "I came home, and you were gone. Do you know what that was like? Do you know what could have happened to you? Someone has to pay for that mistake. There have to be consequences. She didn't leave the gate open." Ilara shouted, tears streaming down her face. "I climbed the fence. I snuck out. She didn't even know I was gone until it was too late. You're just blaming her because you can't blame yourself." "Watch your tongue," Richard warned, pointing a finger at her. "I am your father. I provide this roof over your head. I keep you safe. I did what was necessary to ensure this doesn't happen again." "You didn't keep her safe," Ilara yelled. "You fired the only person in this whole house who actually cares about me. You fired the only person who makes this place feel like a home." Ilara turned and ran from the room. Richard heard her footsteps thundering up the stairs, followed by the slamming of her bedroom door. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. Richard stood alone in the dining room. He looked at the cold toast on her plate. He looked at his expensive coffee. He told himself he was right. He was the adult. He was the one who made the hard choices. But the victory felt hollow. It felt like swallowing a stone. He spent the next hour in his study trying to work, but he couldn't focus. The anger he felt earlier was turning into something else. Nagging, itching feeling in the back of his mind. Ilara's words kept repeating in his head. "She tried to stop me." Finally, Richard stood up. He needed proof. He needed to see the tape to validate his decision. He needed to see that Marjorie had been careless, that she had been on her phone or chatting with the other staff. While his daughter climbed over the wall, he walked down to the security room in the basement. It was a cold, dark space, filled with monitors showing feeds from every camera on the property. The security guard on duty, a young man named Kevin, stood up when Richard entered. "Sir," Kevin said nervously, "is everything all right? Show me the footage from yesterday evening. The garden gate in the east wall." From 6 p.m. onwards, Richard commanded. Kevin typed on the keyboard for a moment. The main screen flickered and changed. Richard watched. At 6:15 p.m., he saw himself storming out of the house, getting into his car, and driving away. He saw Marjorie come out the side door, carrying a tray of hot chocolate. He saw her walk toward the garden, toward Alara. "Turn up the volume," Richard said. The audio was faint, but he could hear it. He watched the screen, his arms crossed over his chest. He saw Marjorie sit on the bench next to Alara. He saw Marjorie put her arm around the girl. He saw Marjorie wipe tears from Alara's face. "Don't go out there, baby." He heard Marjorie's voice through the static. "It's cold. It's not safe." Then the timestamp jumped to 8 p.m. The camera showed Alara getting up, walking toward the ivy-covered wall. Richard leaned in closer. On the screen, Marjorie jumped up. She wasn't lazy. She wasn't negligent. She ran after Alara. Richard watched as Marjorie grabbed Alara's arm, trying to pull her back. "Please, Alara, don't do this," Marjorie begged on the screen. She was tugging at the girl's sleeve. "Mr. Sterling will be home soon. We can talk to him. Just come inside." But Alara shook her off. She pulled away, scrambling up the trellis with a frantic energy. Marjorie stood at the bottom of the wall, her hands raised, looking helpless. She didn't walk away. She stood there for 20 minutes, looking up at the wall, looking down the street, checking her watch, pacing back and forth. She stayed there until it was fully dark, till she was shivering in her thin uniform. Finally, she ran back to the house, presumably to call the police or Richard. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He gripped the back of the chair in front of him till his knuckles turned white. The lie he had told himself, the lie that Marjorie was negligent, that she was careless, shattered in front of him. She hadn't let Alara go. She had fought for her. She had tried to protect her. And he had rewarded her loyalty by throwing her out into the street like trash. "Sir?" Kevin asked quietly. "Are you all right?" Richard didn't answer. He just stared at the screen. He saw the image of Marjorie standing alone in the dark, worried, sick. He thought about her small room in the basement. He thought about her kind eyes. He realized, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that he had destroyed the only good thing in his daughter's life. He had fired the mother figure Alara actually needed, all because he was too proud to admit that his own parenting had driven his daughter away. Richard turned and walked out of the security room. He moved like an old man now. The anger was gone, replaced by a crushing wave of guilt. He walked up the stairs, the house feeling like a tomb around him. He had always believed that being powerful meant being right. But now, standing in the silence of his hallway, he realized that being powerful meant you could make mistakes that hurt people. And you had no one to blame but the man in the mirror. He reached Alara's door and raised his hand to knock, but he stopped. He couldn't face her yet. He had destroyed something precious, and he didn't know if he could ever fix it. He leaned his forehead against the cold wood of the door and closed his eyes, listening to the silence. Knowing he deserved every bit of it, the guilt sat in Richard's chest like a heavy stone, pressing down on his lungs so that it was hard to breathe. For 2 days, he wandered through the mansion like a ghost. The house was cleaner than it had ever been. The new staff were efficient and terrified of him, but it felt cold. It felt sterile. Without Marjorie's quiet humming in the kitchen or her gentle presence in the hallways, the place was just a big box of expensive rooms. Alara had not spoken a word to him since the morning he fired her friend. She stayed in her room, only coming out when Richard was away at work. He would find plates of untouched food in the kitchen. He saw her grades slipping on the reports the school emailed him. He was losing her, and he knew it. He had tried to fix his mistake, by cutting out the person he blamed. But he had only made the wound deeper. On the third day, Richard made a decision. He couldn't fix the past by sitting in his office staring at spreadsheets. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and told his assistant to cancel his meetings for the afternoon. "Where are we going, sir?" Thomas the driver asked as he held the car door open. "To the other side of the city," Richard said, his voice rough. He didn't have an exact address, but he knew where to look. The drive was long. The shiny town car moved from the smooth pavement of the wealthy district to the cracked, potholed streets of the working-class neighborhood where Marjorie had mentioned her sister lived years ago. Richard stared out the window, watching the world change. He saw people walking to bus stops, carrying groceries, living lives that were very different from his own. He realized how sheltered he had been. He realized how easy it was to judge people when you were sitting in a leather seat looking down at them. He found the Strata, narrow block with brick row houses and small front porches. He saw an older woman sitting on a stoop, a few doors down, and rolled down the window. "Excuse me," Richard said. He felt awkward, his expensive suit sticking out like a sore thumb. "I am looking for a woman. Her name is Marjorie. She used to work at the Sterling estate." The woman eyed him suspiciously, taking in the car and the suit. "You, the one who fired her?" The question hit Richard like a slap. He nodded slowly. "Yes, I am." The woman pointed a finger further down the street. "Number 4, to B. She's staying in the basement apartment. You be nice to her? You hear? She's been crying for 2 days." Reacher thanked her and got out of the car. He walked to the door marked 42 bytes and hesitated. He was a man who negotiated million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. But standing at this simple door, his hands were shaking. He took a deep breath and knocked. A moment later, the door opened. Marjorie stood there. She was wearing a simple house dress, and her hair was wrapped in a scarf. When she saw Richard, her face didn't change. It didn't hold the fear it used to. It just looked tired, very tired. "Mr. Sterling," she said softly, "what are you doing here?" "May I come in?" Richard asked. He realized he had no right to demand entry. Marjorie looked at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "The place is small. Watch your head." The apartment was cramped but clean. There were photos on the walls of children and grandchildren Richard had never heard about. It felt warm, filled with the smell of stew cooking on a small stove. It felt more like a home in one room than his entire mansion did. Marjorie didn't offer him a seat. She just stood with her arms crossed, waiting. Richard took off his hat and held it in his hands, turning it over and over. "I watched the tapes," Richard blurted out. Marjorie raised an eyebrow. "The tapes? The security footage from the night Elara ran away?" Richard continued, his voice cracking. "I saw you, Marjorie. I saw you trying to stop her. I saw you standing in the cold, begging her to come back. I saw how long you stayed out there worrying." The room was silent. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. "I accused you of being negligent," Richard said, looking down at his shoes. "I told you that you failed her, but I was wrong. You were the only one doing your job. You were the only one loving her." Marjorie's shoulders dropped a little. "I tried to tell you, sir. I tried to explain. But your mind was made up." "I know," Richard said. "And that is the problem. I am a man who is used to being right, or at least I am used to people telling me I am right. I was angry at myself. I was scared that I had lost her, and I took that fear out on you. I fired you because I needed someone to blame. I fired the one person who actually cares about my daughter." He looked up at her, his eyes wet. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, Marjorie. Most of them I can pay to fix. But this, I can't fix this with money. Elara is destroying herself in that house. She says it is empty without you, and she is right." Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. It was much thicker than the severance check he had given her before. "I want you to come back," Richard said. "I know I have no right to ask. I know I treated you terribly, but she needs you. And to be honest, I think I need you there too. Not just to clean, to help me understand her, to help me be a father." Marjorie looked at the envelope. then back at his face. She searched his eyes, looking for the man she had worked for 20 years. She saw the cracks in his armor. She saw the humility. "I don't want your money, Mr. Sterling," Marjorie said gently. "It is not just money," Richard insisted. "It is for your grandchildren's college fund. It is a penalty I am paying to myself for being a fool. Please, take it. But come back for her." Marjorie sighed, a long, deep sigh. She looked at the photos of her family on the wall, then thought of Alara alone in that big room. "If I come back," Marjorie said slowly, "things have to change. You cannot treat people like they are furniture. You cannot just throw us away when you are angry. And you have to listen to me when I tell you about Alara. Not just hear me, but listen." Richard nodded eagerly. "I promise. A new contract. No more firing without cause. You are the head of the household, Marjorie. You always were." Marjorie looked at him for a long, hard minute. Then she nodded. "Okay, for the girl. I will come back for Alara." A wave of relief washed over Richard so strong he nearly had to sit down. He set the envelope down on her small table. "Let me take you home," he said. The drive back to the estate was different. Richard didn't hide in the back seat. He sat in the middle, talking to Marjorie. He asked about her grandchildren. He asked about her health. For the first time, he saw her not as the maid, but as a woman with a life and wisdom that he lacked. When they pulled up to the mansion, Alara was sitting in the garden. She looked like a statue, staring at nothing. When the car stopped and Marjorie stepped out, Alara froze. She stood up, her eyes wide. Marjorie opened her arms, and Alara ran. She ran across the perfectly trimmed grass and threw herself into the older woman's arms. The sobbing was loud and raw, a sound of pure release. Richard stood by the car, watching. He didn't interfere. He didn't try to control it. He just let them be. That evening, the dining room felt different. Richard insisted that Marjorie sit at the table with them. It was against every rule of etiquette he had ever learned, but he didn't care. They ate simple food roast chicken and potatoes that Marjorie had cooked. The conversation was slow at first, but eventually Alara began to talk. She talked about how scared she was on the street. She talked about how lonely she felt in the house. Richard wanted to interrupt, to defend himself, but he stopped. He bit his tongue. He listened. He listened to his daughter tell him that she didn't care about the gala. She didn't care about the business school. She cared about art. She cared about people. When she paused, Richard took a breath. "Alara," he said, "I am sorry. I am sorry I wasn't there. I am sorry I sent away the person who made this house a home." Alara looked at him, surprised. It was the first time she had ever heard him apologize. "I want to do better," Richard continued. "I don't know how yet, but I want to try." Alara reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Just listen, Dad. That's all. Just listen to us." Over the next few months, the mansion changed. The gates were still there, but they were often left open. The security was still tight, but the fear was gone. Richard spent less time at the office and more time at the dinner table. He even went to an art show with Alara, wearing a suit that cost less than what he usually spent on a tie. But he smiled the whole time. Marjorie stayed. She became more than a housekeeper. She became the glue that held them together. She wasn't just staff anymore. She was family. Richard learned a lesson that no business school could teach him. He learned that the most valuable things in life aren't the things you own or the power you hold. The most valuable things are the people who love you enough to tell you the truth, even when you don't want to hear it. He had built a business empire, but on the night he fired Marjorie, he had nearly lost his kingdom. By humbling himself to bring her back, he finally found the thing he had been searching for all his life. He finally had a home.